All right, so now we're going to see the actual fighting of the war. Now, during the war, the Triple Entente becomes known as the Allied powers, and the Triple Alliance becomes known as the Central Powers, which can be a little confusing at times that the Triple Alliance now becomes the Central Powers. But just remember where the Central Powers are: Germany and Austria. They're in the center of Europe, so Central Powers makes it a little easier to understand. Now, when the war started, both sides were operating under a set of illusions that proved to be false. Both sides thought that the war would be over quickly. Often, the word was that it would be over by Christmas 1914. But that is not what is going to happen. And by the end of 1915, there will be a stalemate where neither side can make any progress or figure out how to win the war. One reason is because the Schieffelin plan doesn't work. In the Western Front, that's where the Germans are fighting against, at first, the French and the British and the Belgians. Now, remember, this was the plan. The plan was to go through Belgium very quickly to get into France, going around the French fortifications along their shared border, swing around and capture Paris in a matter of weeks. That was the plan. This is what actually happened. If you look at it, if you compare them side by side, this was the plan and then this was reality. It started to go wrong because of the Belgians. The Schieffelin plan relies on speed, but the Belgians resisted far more and far harder than the Germans expected. And then the British Expeditionary Force, the British Army, showed up to support the Belgians as well. And so all of a sudden, the German army is slowed. And then on the Eastern Front, which we'll talk about in a couple of minutes, the Russians were winning a series of victories because they had mobilized quicker than the Germans were expecting. So some of the German troops that were supposed to fight in the West are now fighting in the East against the Russians. This too slows down the German army. And then, if you look at the plan and compare it to the reality, the German army swung down basically too soon. Swung down to the east of Paris. And once the French military command realized the German mistake, they were able to launch a massive offensive, to stop them at the Marne. You can see it at the bottom of the screen there. And that kind of became the metaphorical line in the sand for the French, and they stopped the German advance at the Marne. Remember, the Schieffelin plan relied on speed, and now the German army has been stopped dead in its tracks because of the French and the British. The French just kind of threw everything that they had at the Germans at the Marne, even getting soldiers to the front lines using Parisian taxi cabs because they knew they had to stop the Germans, and they do. So those orange boxes, those are the Germans. The French box, so the French in that blue box, the British. What happens is after they're stopped at the Marne, each side tries to get around the other, tries to outflank the other until they run into the English Channel, until they run into water. Now there's nowhere to go. You can't charge forward because the enemy will tear you apart with their machine guns. So everyone's just kind of stuck, and everyone literally just digs in. It's the development of trench warfare. No one saw it coming. It was not planned. It just kind of evolved organically until you have a series of trenches that stretch from the English Channel all the way down to the Swiss Alps. And now both sides are literally dug in, and no one really knows what to do because no one has really seen trench warfare. The generals were used to wars of movement. That's what they had been trained for. They had not been trained for trench warfare. That's why you end up having a stalemate through most of 1915. Neither side can make any progress. No one really knows what to do. Now, on the Eastern Front, you see more of a traditional warfare based on movement. As I said, at first the Russians rattled off a string of victories, mainly because the Germans just were surprised. They didn't think the Russians would be able to mobilize that quickly. But once the Germans got their act together, they began to soundly defeat the Russians. The Russian military was quite large, but it was poorly supplied. Some soldiers were sent to the front lines without guns. They were poorly led as well. Tsar Nicholas II meant well, but he was a poor military commander, and the German army was simply better. And they began to rattle off a string of victories against the Russians. And then also in the Eastern Front, Serbia actually is defeated and taken out of the war by the end of 1915, but the war continues, which proves it wasn't just about Serbia to begin with. Remember, all these countries each have their individual motivations for the war. So the Eastern Front is great for the Germans. The Western Front, that's where the stalemate is. That's where nobody really knows what to do. So you get to 1916. Remember, the war was supposed to be over by Christmas 1914. Now it's 1916, and it's still going on. And generals are on both sides are under great pressure to do something. And the only thing that they can think of to maybe win is a war of attrition. A war of attrition does not involve complicated strategy. A war of attrition is just simply where you try to wear down the other side through constant attacks. That's the only thing that they could think of. In short, the only thing they could think of is charge at the enemy trench and hope for the best. This is why your textbook titles 1916, 1917, The Great Slaughter. These 2 years are going to see massive casualties, dead and wounded, on both sides because of that trench warfare. Basically, all they could come up with is you would tell your soldiers to prepare for the attack. They would fix bayonets on their rifles. Word would go out that you go over the top of the trench and you charge toward the enemy trench and hope you can take it. And so if you had to go over the top, as it's called, get out of your trench, you had to go through no man's land, through the enemy barbed wire, try to take the front line trench, but then there were backup trenches behind that. You can see why this led to great slaughter, particularly with both sides now having machine guns. Now, sometimes students ask, why didn't they just like tunnel underneath the enemy trench? Both sides did that frequently. But remember, the trenches go all the way from the English Channel to the Alps. So at times, it could be effective, but it was never quite a game changer. But they did try to dig like underneath the tunnels, and eventually we're going to see new technology deployed as well. Probably the two most infamous battles of World War I is Verdun and Somme. At Verdun, it was mainly the Germans versus the French. And this battle lasted 9 months, and both sides had massive casualties, around 1 million casualties all together. And Verdun leads to the Battle of the Somme because the British and French thought, well, if we can launch a major offensive at the Somme, that will suck German troops from Verdun to Somme and ease the problem at Verdun. The Somme also had massive amount of casualties. The Somme is also the first battle where tanks are deployed by the British. It's also one of the first battles where aircraft are used in combat situations. And all told, a few miles of land were gained by the Allies, and it cost millions of men on both sides. So it's a great example of what your book called the Great Slaughter, that war of attrition. You gain very little ground. You're just trying to wear down the other side. And one reason why this war was so devastating is because new technology is being used. This is one of the first major wars since full industrialization. So there's all kinds of new technology that make war deadlier. World War I is a transitional war where you're going from that traditional warfare, war on horseback, as you can see in this picture, to modern warfare, which include gas attacks, which you can see the soldier is wearing a gas mask. So this is a great picture, a literal picture of that of World War I in transition from the old way to the new way. This new technology just makes things so much deadlier, like the machine gun. If you're charging an enemy trench and they have a handful of machine gunners, a handful of machine gunners can take on a large amount of enemy troops, just mow them down. And it was easy to train them as well. And so you could just constantly resupply these machine gunners. Airplanes, first they were used to simply spot the enemy, spy on the enemy basically, but eventually the planes began to fight each other in the sky, and then they began to drop bombs. And at first the bombs were very crude, but it's a sign of things to come. World War II will be famous for its air combat. And you had famous pilots like the Red Baron, who both sides knew and respected. The British invented the tank. This is one reason why you don't see trench warfare in World War II. Because by the time you get to World War II, the tanks are so much better and efficient, sitting in a trench doesn't make any sense. First use of the flamethrower to try to clear out the enemy trenches. poisonous gas was used for the first time. It was called the Second Battle of Ypres in Belgium. Both sides used it. It was horrendous. There was different kinds of gas. Some of the gas, once you breathe it in, it kind of burned your lungs from the inside out and suffocated you. It blinded soldiers, sometimes temporarily, sometimes permanently. And because of all this new technology and this war of attrition, that's why the casualty rates are so high in World War I.